Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. We're going to ancient Egypt today.
Sounds exciting.
You guys have sent in some really fascinating stuff, and there's one YouTube video and transcript that really stood out.
Right.
It really throws those typical timelines that you see in the textbooks out the window.
Interesting.
This video, it's called ETHAL2 by Ahmed Adli.
Okay.
And it suggests a pretty wild idea. What if there was this lost civilization in Egypt?
Okay.
One that was way more advanced than we ever thought possible. And what if it existed like thousands of years before the dynasties that we know about?
That's a big claim. What kind of evidence does the video present?
Well, one of the things that really caught my attention was how they used the writings of Herodotus.
Oh, the ancient Greek historian.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
To challenge our whole understanding of time, like the concept of time itself.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does Herodotus fit into this?
So Herodotus, he wrote about these Egyptian priests who claimed that the sun had actually risen in the west twice.
Wait, what? The sun rising in the west?
Yeah, I know, right?
That seems impossible.
It does. And they even gave like a specific time frame for this. They said 39,000 years.
Whoa, that's way longer than the typical 3,000 or 4,000 years we usually think about with ancient Egypt.
Exactly. That's what makes it so mind-blowing.
So how do they explain that? The sun rising in the west.
Well, that's where things get really cool. It turns out that this seemingly impossible idea could actually be explained by something called precession.
Obsession, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, so imagine the Earth kind of wobbling on its axis, like as it spins, like a spinning top when it starts to slow down.
Okay, yeah, I can picture that.
Over these really, really long periods of time, that wobble actually changes the position of the rising and setting sun.
So you're saying that if we rewind the clock far enough, the sun really could have appeared to rise in the west, at least from an ancient Egyptian perspective.
Exactly.
Wow, that's amazing. It really makes you think about how differently they might have experienced the world.
I know, right? And it ties into those ancient Egyptian beliefs about like cyclical time.
Right.
And a first time, which they call Shira.
So they believed there was a time before recorded history.
Exactly. They believed that there was this period that stretched back way further than we can even imagine.
It's like they had an entirely different concept of history, one that dwarfs our current understanding.
Absolutely. And it's not just Herodotus. The video highlights some archaeological discoveries that really shake up that conventional timeline as well.
Oh, like what?
Well, there's the Child of Tecumseh skeleton, and get this, it's estimated to be 50,000 years old.
50,000 years old. That's incredible.
Yeah.
That discovery alone really challenges the idea that Egyptian civilization only began a few thousand years ago.
It does.
So are we missing big parts of the story?
It's like we are missing these huge pieces of the puzzle, and the video even suggests that we've been misinterpreting some of the pieces we do have.
How so?
Well, they argue that later dynasties were basically masters of what they call repurposing.
Repurposing?
Yeah, essentially they took older artifacts, especially statues and obelisks, and they just slapped their own names on them.
That's interesting.
Like they were taking credit for stuff that wasn't actually theirs.
It makes sense, though. I mean, if we're using inscriptions to date artifacts, but those inscriptions were added much later,
Right.
our entire timeline could be off.
It's like if you found this amazing Renaissance painting, but then assumed that it was actually created in the 19th century, just because someone added a signature and a date in the corner.
Right, the context would be totally wrong.
The video actually gives this really cool example of a red granite sphinx that's in the Louvre. It's this massive, impressive piece.
I've seen pictures of that. It's beautiful.
It is. And it turns out that this thing was actually reinscribed by a bunch of different pharaohs over time.
So each pharaoh was basically claiming it as their own.
Exactly. Like, hey, look, I made this.
That's wild. We have no idea who the original artist was then.
Nope, no clue.
It's fascinating how the desire to connect to the past, to have that prestigious lineage, can actually distort the historical record.
Totally. And it's not just the Sphinx either. There are statues in the Louvre and the Met that were initially uninscribed,
Okay.
but then later had the names of Ramesses II and his son Meremta added to them.
It's like they were building their own family photo albums, but with statues.
I know, right? It's like ancient Egyptian bragging rights.
Exactly. And then there are those colossal granite statues at Luxor Temple. I've always loved those.
Oh, they're incredible. Those are the ones traditionally attributed to Ramesses II, right?
Right. But the video points out that there are actually inconsistencies in their style
Okay.
and even their facial features that suggest they could be much, much older.
So you're saying that Ramesses might have just taken credit for these already existing statues?
It's definitely possible. He was known for being a bit of a self-promoter.
It makes you wonder how many other statues might have been repurposed this way.
Right. And what does that say about our ability to truly understand the timeline of ancient Egypt?
It's a really good question, and we're going to keep exploring that in part 2 of our deep dive.
I can't wait to see what other examples they have. This is fascinating.
I know. It's like we're starting to see ancient Egypt in a whole new light.
It's definitely making me rethink some things.
Me too. See you in part 2.
See you then. It's amazing how that whole idea of repurposing makes you rethink how we view these grand monuments. But it also makes you wonder how the historical narratives themselves might have been shaped over time.
Yeah, you're right.
Because who was doing the writing?
Exactly. Like, how much can we actually trust those inscriptions and those texts that we rely on to understand ancient Egypt?
Like,
The video argues that a lot of these historical accounts are actually full of bias and maybe even propaganda.
well, it makes sense if you think about who was writing those accounts.
Yeah.
It was the pharaohs and their scribes who, had a vested interest in presenting like a certain version of events, right?
It's like reading a politician's memoir today. You kind of have to take it with a grain of salt.
Exactly.
The video actually uses the example of Ramesses II and his supposed big victory at the Battle of Kadesh.
Oh, yeah.
His account makes him sound like he's this unbeatable warrior, single-handedly crushed his enemies.
Right, but when you compare his version to the Hittite account of the same battle, you get a very different picture.
Totally.
They suggest that it was a much closer fight. Maybe neither side truly dominated.
It shows how easily history can be manipulated, right?
Oh, absolutely.
To serve a particular agenda.
For sure.
And it's not just battles either. The video points out that even the depictions of the pharaohs themselves could be super misleading.
Interesting.
Take Tutankhamun.
Ah, yes, the boy king.
Yes. He became pharaoh when he was, 9 years old? But all the inscriptions and the artwork, they portray him as this, powerful military leader.
Right, projecting that image of strength.
Yeah, projecting an image of strength and authority.
Even if it didn't quite match up with reality.
Even though he was just a kid. And Hatshepsut.
Oh, yes, Hatshepsut.
The female pharaoh.
Right. She had to overcome a lot of obstacles to rule.
Absolutely. And she faced even more pressure to prove that she had a legitimate right to rule.
Right.
And her inscriptions, they really go to great lengths to emphasize this divine right to rule, linking her directly to the god Amun.
It's like ancient Egypt had its own version of a PR machine.
Totally. Carefully crafting that perfect image they wanted to project to the world.
It all makes you wonder what's real and what's not.
I know. And all these examples really show how important it is to consider, the source of the information, right?
Absolutely.
Who wrote it?
Right. What were their motivations?
What might have been left out or maybe even exaggerated?
We need to be historical detectives.
Yes. Always on the lookout for clues.
Looking at different perspectives.
We can't just rely on what's written down.
For sure. We need to examine all sorts of evidence.
And sometimes even the absence of evidence can be telling.
Oh, that's a good point.
The video actually calls this the silence of the stones.
The silence of the stones, huh? What do they mean by that?
Well, they're talking about how a lot of ancient Egyptian monuments, like pyramids and temples, even tombs, they don't have any inscriptions at all.
That's true. But if those structures were built by the same civilization that created all those super detailed inscriptions we've been talking about, wouldn't they have wanted to, leave their mark? Take credit for all their hard work?
Exactly. And that's the question the video asks. Could it be that those uninscribed monuments were actually created by a totally different civilization?
Okay.
One that came before the dynasties we know about.
Interesting.
The civilization that had a different way of approaching history,
So are you saying there could be a whole chapter of Egyptian history that's just missing?
Maybe.
Because they didn't write anything down?
It's a possibility, right?
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is.
It really makes you question our assumptions about how we piece together the past.
Right.
I mean, we tend to rely so much on written accounts.
Yeah.
But what if other civilizations had different ways of communicating?
Or different ways of commemorating their achievements.
Exactly. There's like those stories you hear about ancient cultures passing down knowledge through oral traditions.
Yeah. Instead of writing everything down.
Right. And if we're only focused on what's been written, we could be missing huge parts of the story.
Huge parts. And to further explore that idea, the video actually looks at obelisks.
Oh, obelisks, those towering monuments.
Yes. They were central to Egyptian culture, and they offer another look into that whole concept of repurposing.
Okay, I'm listening.
So we often think of obelisks as these grand, permanent structures, right?
Right.
But the video points out that a lot of them weren't actually inscribed until way after they were put up.
Interesting. That raises some questions.
It does, right? Like, were they originally meant for something else entirely?
And were they even created by the pharaohs that we usually associate them with?
Exactly. For example, Hatshepsut's obelisks,
Okay.
while she claimed to have, quarried them herself,
Right.
there's evidence that suggests they were actually started by her predecessor, her husband, Thutmose II.
Another example of a pharaoh rewriting history,
It's like a path.
trying to boost their legacy.
And it gets even more complicated when you realize that some obelisks actually have inscriptions from tons of different pharaohs,
Oh, wow.
added over, centuries.
So these monuments were being passed down and reused.
Yeah, it's almost like each new ruler wanted to add their own little mark to history, to be like, I was here.
It highlights how history is not always as straightforward as we think.
Right.
It can change, be reinterpreted.
Yeah.
And when we start questioning those timelines and attributions,
Yeah.
a whole world of possibilities opens up.
We've talked about skeletons that are way older than they should be.
Right.
Artifacts that could be much older than we thought. And statues and obelisks that were basically repurposed and rebranded.
Yes, and all these examples suggest that the story of ancient Egypt is much more complex
And more nuanced.
than we typically give it credit for.
It's like we're peeling back these layers of history
Yes.
and revealing a much more intricate story.
Revealing secrets, hidden truths.
So is the video suggesting that there's a whole missing chunk of Egyptian history, a lost era that's older than all the dynasties we know?
That's exactly where they're heading.
Oh, this is getting good.
It is. And in part 3, we're going to dive into what they call the 4 pillars of evidence for that conventional timeline of ancient Egypt. And we'll see if those pillars are as strong as they seem.
I can't wait. This is fascinating.
Me too, I'm hooked.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive, and things are about to get really interesting. We've been exploring some pretty wild ideas about ancient Egypt.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
And now it's time to tackle what the video calls the 4 pillars of evidence.
Well, 4 pillars, huh? Sounds serious.
They are. These are the arguments that are often used to say, see, the Great Pyramid, totally built by Pharaoh Khufu around 2500 BCE, case closed. But are these pillars as solid as they seem? That's what we're going to find out.
Okay, I'm ready to hear this.
Let's start with the workers' tombs that were discovered near the Great Pyramid back in the 1990s.
Oh yeah, those were a big deal.
Huge discovery at the time. They were seen as proof positive that there was this massive workforce present during the pyramid's construction.
Makes sense, but what's the catch? The video obviously thinks there's more to it.
Yeah, the video raises a really important question.
What's that?
Okay, so we've got these tombs, right? They definitely belong to workers.
Right.
But is there anything that actually directly links them to Khufu's reign? Or to the building of the pyramid itself?
It's a good point. Proximity doesn't necessarily equal connection.
Exactly. The tombs themselves, they don't have any inscriptions mentioning Khufu, or the pyramid, for that matter.
I think I see.
And the titles of the officials who are buried there, things like overseer of the king's works, or
Right.
chief of the carpenters, those are pretty general, right?
Yeah, they could apply to tons of different projects during that period, not just the pyramid.
Exactly. It's like finding construction tools near a building site. You might think, oh, they must have been used to build that building.
Right.
But without more specific proof, you can't be totally sure.
You need that smoking gun, that direct link.
And here's another thing to consider. Construction at Giza, it didn't just stop after Khufu died.
Oh, right. It went on for centuries. Other pharaohs built stuff there.
Yeah, temples, causeways, smaller pyramids.
So it's totally possible that those workers' tombs are actually from those later projects.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to be careful about jumping to conclusions,
Always question those assumptions.
Always. Okay, pillar number 2.
Bring it on.
The Wadi al-Jarf papyri.
Oh, yeah. These were huge when they were found in 2013.
Huge, because they seem to provide first-hand accounts of how those massive stones were transported to build the pyramid.
A lot of people thought they'd finally solved the mystery.
I know, right? But the video encourages us to take a closer look at what those papyri actually say.
Okay, so what's the catch with the papyri?
Well, they detailed movement of stone under this official named mirror,
Okay,
but they never actually say that those stones were for the Great Pyramid.
interesting.
The papyri do mention a place called Rao Khufu, which is often translated as Khufu's horizon or Khufu's storehouse.
And that's the connection people make to the pyramid.
Exactly. But the video suggests that Rao Khufu might not even refer to the pyramid at all.
Oh, so what else could it be?
Maybe a broader administrative region or like a central location where they were storing materials or processing them.
That would make more sense, considering the papyri talk about sailing to and from this Rao Khufu, which seems to imply it was a separate spot, not the pyramid itself.
Yeah, like it'd be like saying that someone worked at like Google headquarters. Doesn't necessarily mean that they were actually coding in Silicon Valley.
Right, they could have been working in HR in, like, Omaha.
Exactly. Khufu had tons of building projects all over Egypt.
Right, he wasn't just obsessed with the pyramid.
Those stones could have been for anything.
Okay, so 2 pillars down.
And both looking kind of shaky. Let's see what happens with pillar number 3.
I'm on the edge of my seat.
This one focuses on Hemiunu, Khufu's vizier.
Oh, right, the guy often credited as the architect of the Great Pyramid.
The supposed mastermind.
Yeah.
His statue, which was discovered in 1912, it's an incredible piece.
It is.
But even though he's linked to the pyramid,
Yeah.
neither his statue nor the inscriptions on it actually mention the pyramid at all.
Wait, what?
It's crazy. If there's no direct evidence, how did he become known as the pyramid's architect?
Yeah, how did that connection get made?
Seems to be based on assumptions and circumstantial evidence.
Okay.
So his statue was found near this large mastaba at Giza, and his titles include like overseer of all the king's works.
Yeah, but those are pretty vague titles.
Super vague. So the thinking is, important official, big tomb found near the pyramid. Must have built the pyramid.
That seems like a big leap in logic.
A huge leap, especially when you consider that other officials from that time period, they specifically mention their role in building pyramids.
Right, in their tomb inscription.
Like, hey, I helped build this thing. If Hemiunu was truly the mastermind behind the Great Pyramid, don't you think he'd want everyone to know?
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't brag about that?
The video suggests that he was probably in charge of loads of different royal projects, not just the pyramid.
Makes sense.
Okay, so 3 pillars down.
And none of them are holding up very well. This is getting intense. What about the 4th pillar? The one that's supposed to be like the most convincing evidence.
Ah, yes, the Khufu cartouche.
A smoking guy.
Found inside the Great Pyramid. This is considered to be the ultimate proof, you know? But as the video reveals, even this evidence is super controversial.
Ooh, this is where it gets really interesting. Spill the tea.
All right, so the cartouche, which is basically Khufu's name written inside this oval shape.
Right.
It was found in 1837 by this British explorer named Howard Vyse.
Okay.
But the video raises some serious doubts about its authenticity.
Really? What kind of doubts?
Well, for one thing, the cartouche isn't carved into the stone. It's painted on in red ochre.
That does seem a little casual for something so important.
Right. You'd think they'd want something a little more permanent.
For sure.
And here's the other thing. The cartouche is only found in like the upper chambers of the pyramid.
Okay.
The ones that Vyse had to blast his way into with explosives.
Oh, no.
No cartouches were found in the lower chambers, which had already been explored.
That does raise some red flags.
Right.
It's a bit suspicious.
And when you dig into the historical context, it gets even more intriguing.
Okay, tell me more.
So Vyse, he was under a lot of pressure to find something amazing, something to justify using all those explosives to explore the pyramid.
Right, he needed to show results.
Exactly. And his reputation wasn't exactly squeaky clean either.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, he was later accused of some pretty shady financial dealings back in England.
So are you saying the cartouche could be a fake? Planted there by Vyse to make himself look good?
It's definitely a possibility. The video presents some pretty compelling evidence to support the forgery theory.
What kind of evidence?
Well, Vyse's own journals, they have sketches of the cartouche, but they're actually inaccurate.
Inaccurate.
Yeah, it's like he was copying it from somewhere else and not drawing what he actually saw.
Oh, wow, that's a big deal.
Right. It's like he was caught cheating on a test.
A very high-stakes test.
Yeah.
And what about that letter that supposedly surfaced? The one claiming that Vyse's assistant saw the cartouche being faked.
Oh, yeah, that's a bombshell. But the video does acknowledge that it's really hard to verify if that letter itself is actually genuine.
So we're left with a mystery. Is the cartouche real or is it a fake? It's like a historical whodunit.
I know, right? The video doesn't give a definitive answer, but it urges us to be skeptical, to keep an open mind, you know.
To think critically about the evidence.
Exactly. So if those 4 pillars aren't as strong as we thought they were, what does that mean for our understanding of the Great Pyramid and the civilization that built it? What do we do now?
Well, the video isn't trying to completely rewrite history, and they don't claim to have all the answers,
Oh, okay.
but they are inviting us to consider different interpretations, to
Right.
question what we think we know, and to embrace the mystery,
To be okay with not knowing everything.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. It's way more exciting to think that there are still things to discover, secrets waiting to be uncovered.
Absolutely. It's like approaching history with this sense of curiosity and wonder.
Exactly.
We need to be comfortable with those gaps in our knowledge and to keep searching for the truth.
And who knows what other amazing discoveries are waiting for us out there. I mean, this has been an incredible deep dive.
It really has. We've covered so much, from astronomical phenomena to potentially forged cartouches.
It's really made me think about how much we still don't know about ancient Egypt.
Me too. So, does this change how you view ancient Egypt? Are you ready to question the traditional narrative and consider that there might be more to learn?
Absolutely. There are always more layers to uncover. The past is full of surprises.
And that's what makes exploring it so exciting. Keep asking those questions and see you on our next deep dive.
See you then. I can't wait to see what other mysteries we uncover.